Hello and good evening, everyone. I'm Archit Seshadri. Thanks for watching Gravitas, where we delve into the headlines of the day and bring you an analysis and perspective on various issues around the globe. Tonight, Donald Trump proves that promises during his election campaign were not just rhetoric, and he meant every word of it. On Wednesday, he will order the construction of the controversial wall along the Mexican border. But first, a Supreme Court ruling on Brexit brings Theresa May back into the drawing board. The UK Supreme Court ruled that British Prime Minister Theresa May cannot start the Brexit process without passing legislation through Parliament. So can Brexit now be stopped? And what does this mean for May's plans to trigger the process by the end of March? WION's London Bureau Chief Mandy Clark reports.
Statement, the Secretary of State for...
By a margin of 8-3, Britain's top judges ruled that Theresa May must go through Parliament to begin the formal process of cutting ties with the European Union. It also ruled that the Scottish Parliament, the Welsh and Northern Ireland assemblies do not get a say in the matter. Brexit Secretary David Davis promised a straightforward parliamentary bill on Brexit within days. He also issued a warning to MPs who were planning to derail the process.
I trust no one will seek to make it a vehicle for attempts to thwart the will of the people or frustrate or delay the process of exit from the European Union.
The government hopes to pass the bill through the House of Commons within 2 weeks, well in time for its deadline to trigger the Brexit process by the end of March. Of course, in theory, the bill might not pass and the government would be blocked from leaving the EU. But that's unlikely to happen. The Conservatives do have a majority in the House of Commons. And even those MPs who backed their main side during the referendum have accepted the result of the vote and will likely back the Prime Minister. Even the opposition Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn says his party will not frustrate the process and respect the will of the people. But he did say Labour would prevent the Conservatives from using Brexit to turn the UK into a tax haven off the coast of Europe. But the Scottish National Party does plan to slow the process down. It says it would put forward serious and substantive amendments to the bill and wants Mrs May to consult the Scottish Government on her negotiation aims. Mandy Clark, WION, London.
Well, to discuss this issue, we have Rachit Ranjan, a trade and foreign policy analyst in the studio, as well as Pramit Pal, a foreign editor for the Hindustan Times, joining us tonight. Thanks so much for joining in the discussion. Let's get your perspective, first of all, Pramit Pal, with regards to this. Was this ruling a little bit unexpected when we've seen it? It's been more than 6 months now since that vote to leave the union came. What do we make of this?
Well, there had been an argument that given the remarkable degree of integration that has happened between the EU and London, the Britain since the 1970s, and the fact that huge swaths of Britain's legal system, in fact, almost all of its laws, I think about 70 to 80% of its laws in the past 40 years, have been done via the EU, and much of its regulatory structure is also basically the EU, that she couldn't really Britain really couldn't pull out of the European Union purely on an executive decision. It had to go through the legislature. And Britain doesn't have a written constitution, so there was a bit of, and this is obviously the first time Britain had ever integrated itself as a sovereign nation into something like the European Union. So there had been a bit of a debate. So inevitably it went to the courts, and I was not all that surprised that the courts eventually said that Parliament is the supreme decider of laws in the land,
right? And
you can't do this without such a remarkably important decision. To not go to Parliament on this struck the law lords as unacceptable.
Let's now go to Rachit with regards to this. Rachit, what are some of the legal implications, the challenges at this point that the UK faces when it comes to Brexit?
So I think, as Pramit mentioned, that the level of integration between the UK and the EU was very, very deep, and it comes by way of a law which was passed in 1972. So it naturally had to go through a parliamentary process before any of that could be repealed. So this Supreme Court judgment was very much expected. But what you see as a relief for the Conservatives over here is that the devolved administration, namely the Scottish Assembly or the Welsh Assembly, will not have any say in this. Yep. So I look at this as a minor hiccup.
Right.
I do not see a lot of challenges in the UK Parliament, although the Scottish National Party and some of the other liberal parties are going to try to propose some sort of amendments, substantive amendments to this. I do not see any sort of challenge, and I see Theresa May meeting the March deadline, very much so.
And sort of jumping off of that, Pramit, I'll ask you that question as well. Do we think that, she was perhaps trying to circumvent the Parliament, or did she just, was it a mistake on her part, to sort of circumvent this whole process? And sort of what Rajat just talked about, is this March deadline still achievable?
Well, I think the deadline is achievable. I think for May, the problem was always, which is actually the basis for the entire decision to hold a referendum in the first place, is that the Tory party is deeply divided on the issue of the European Union. And both she and Cameron before her, and you can go back, to 3 or 4 previous Conservative prime ministers, have all struggled with the fact that about half their party does not like the European Union, while the other half of the party believes that Britain has no choice but to be part of the European Union.
Right.
And the referendum by Cameron was basically designed to end the battle within the Tory party and end it once and for all. And of course it failed miserably. And so May, therefore, I think also would prefer, as any Tory party leader would, to have to not to go before Parliament, because the battle within her own party will once again begin. And while ultimately a whip can be issued to force the party to vote in a certain way, it will reveal once again that the Tory party is not internally reconciled to the issue of European Union or not being part of the European Union.
All right, we're going to continue this conversation in just a bit, but now joining me from London is Swathi Dhingra, a lecturer in economics from the London School of Economics. Thank you so much for sharing your perspective with regards to what's going on there with Brexit. Swathi, give us a sense of what it's like there, over the last few months, especially now, specifically for South Asians. Let's talk about, students and those people who are there on visas. Has this changed? Has the mood there changed since the referendum came out back in June?
I think definitely the mood has changed, and one way we know that it has changed is that hate crimes are almost 40% up since the time of the referendum, since the vote. And I think that has created this level of uncertainty and definitely some level of sort of mistrust amongst people, which is really too sad. And it's showing up in sort of reduced applications from students. It's showing up essentially in terms of people wondering whether the visa obligations that they currently meet, whether they're going to continue to be valid or not.
Rajat, let me ask you a question with regards to some of the agreements there with regards to the human rights agreement, the trade agreements. How is the UK likely to be impacted, with this move forward as the UK prepares to exit the European Union?
So I think one thing that we must bear in mind is that the UK in itself has not negotiated a trade treaty for the past 43 years.
Right.
It is done through the European Economic Committee and then the EU. Since the EU came into existence, there have been about 1,139 bilateral and multilateral arrangements which have been signed. Now, these are in the form of an EU-only agreement and a mixed agreement, where an EU-only agreement applies to the territory of EU, whereas a mixed agreement, there are certain elements of that which require domestic ratification.
Right.
So, for example, there are environmental and labor standards that would necessarily require ratification by the UK Parliament. So as far as the EU-only agreements are concerned, UK is directly out of those agreements. So that means that it would have to renegotiate these agreements with the third parties such as Korea, China, and all these countries.
Right.
When you look at the mixed agreements, again, UK has the option of either continuing the existing arrangement or starting a new arrangement altogether. But one must remember that for this to happen, UK needs to really beef up its trade negotiation capacity, which it does not have currently. It's been in conversation with Swiss diplomats to find out what was the best way they integrated themselves in the EU system, but it's going to be quite a challenge for the trade negotiators in EU.
And Pramit, sort of jumping off on that with regards to the trade, your impacts and your thoughts on that, with regards to what we may see going forward as this process continues over the next few years, specifically when it comes to trade. Is this going to be sort of a learning game that they'll have to just figure out and see what works?
Yes, it'll be a relearning game because, as has been mentioned, the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, the trade part of it basically doesn't exist anymore.
Right.
When I used to visit the Foreign Office, they used to have a very big trade negotiating team, which now essentially just became trade analysts because they really didn't have anything to do. Brussels did all the negotiating for them. And trade negotiations is extraordinarily complicated. It is it's an army of essentially lawyers and diplomats mixed together with a long history and experience of the technical details of trade, and they simply don't have that anymore. The other problem that they will face is that in any trade negotiations normally take years on end. I mean, the WTO rounds go on for a decade is normal for a WTO round. And in this case, where you have a global trade environment which is pretty hostile across the board, everybody is fighting to essentially get as much protection as possible. Britain will be seen as effectively a weak player, a negotiating partner who is desperate to get trade deals. And so they will get no mercy from the Europeans. And as it's already been clear, when they want to go to America, China, Japan, and India, the 4 or 5 big non-EU countries they've gone to, they've gotten really hard positions from each of them. Obama said, you go to the end of the line as far as I'm concerned. China has basically said, well, we don't really care.
Right.
India said, give us, and India is going to be particularly difficult because what is the problem that India has had with the EU FTA was immigration, Mode 4 services. The equivalent of getting an H-1B visa. The country that put up the stiffest opposition within the EU to this was Britain. Now, Britain is going to negotiate on its own, and India will say, well, give us Mode 4 services.
Right.
And Britain will say, that is exactly why we left the European Union. And then India will say, well, then screw you. We're not going to negotiate. We don't need you as much as you need our market a lot more than we need you. And so you can see this process going across the board. China will demand, she's talking about manufacturing jobs. China is going to demand a huge access for manufacturing because that's their strength. America will demand similar things in services and technology. You can go on and on. Each of these countries will extract more than a pound of flesh from Britain. And the problem is that these will all be interrelated. Each country will be watching the other country, and as Britain concedes something to India, China says, give us that too.
Right.
And then on top of all this, which is going to be the real problem, is that the European Union negotiations are going to be a nightmare. And the EU has already indicated to Britain that you will not be allowed to go ahead with your negotiations with other countries until you finished with us first. We will not accept that and you can't go off and sit down, I've got to deal with America, let's use this as a basis. EU said nothing doing.
Swati, let me bring you back into the conversation. When it comes to the trade with India, let's talk about immigration again. What type of impacts could this have with regards to Brexit, especially folks trying to leave India, go over there? Could this be sort of Britain's loss? Could be maybe some other countries in Europe's gain?
I think definitely what Theresa May had indicated and throughout what has been indicated is that they are going to try and do something about high-skill immigration to try and fill the skill shortages that exist in the country. But that being said, exactly what was just said before me was that when the EU-India deal was being negotiated, UK put up the biggest opposition. And in fact, the Conservative Party pretty much split across these lines about whether they were going to give India immigration relaxations or not. I think it's going to be very, very problematic to do that going forward, and which is why many of the deals that the UK would have to do if it were to exit from the European Union and from the customs union, many of those deals are not going to be something which is going to happen overnight just because they've left the EU. Many of the sort of issues that exist which slowed the EU in doing trade negotiations with these outside non-EU countries, those issues will continue, and the UK is one of the parties which does face many of the same issues like migration restrictions.
Rachit, let me bring you back into the conversation. When it comes to immigration, as we just talked about, What barriers do you think people may face? People who are either living there or people who are looking to perhaps go there, especially in the era of Brexit. Could this mean they may decide to go to other countries, perhaps not even in Europe, outside? And what impacts could this have?
I think one of the immigration is going to be one of the biggest impacts of Brexit, because the most wonderful thing about EU was the EU citizenship rights and the freedom of movement across EU countries. And this is something that would become subject to scrutiny by immigration authorities in the UK, and this is going to significantly restrict the movement of EU citizens in the UK and their ability to secure jobs in the UK. Another interesting thing to consider over here is a lot of companies that set up their base in London did so with the intention of accessing the European market, both for their personnel and for the goods and services. And with Brexit coming into effect, what will happen is that the personnel, the movement of the personnel will be restricted. UK will be subject to the same regulations. It will not get preferential access in terms of goods and services to the EU market anymore. So that's a considerable challenge that UK looks at.
Pramipal, let me jump in with you and ask you, could this also mean other countries in the European Union could follow suit? Has this been a precedent that now the UK has already
definitely.
set?
I mean, France and the Netherlands, both of which are going for elections. The Marie Le Pen of the National Front and Geert Wilders, both have basically argued that this is a precedent for what they want to do. I mean, they've always been anti-European Union. But Wilders, for example, is very clear that the primary reason he feels Netherlands should leave is the issue of migration. And he said, I want to throw every Muslim out of this country if I come to power.
Very similar to what Trump is making in the US.
So but America's not part of the European Union, though. But the point is that Netherlands, Geert Wilders is effectively saying exactly what Nigel Farage said in England, that I want to leave, and immigration is the core issue on which Netherlands should walk out. Now, Wilders, the expectation is, I gather, that he'll be the #1 party, but it's a proportional representation system. And the other parties have sworn that they will form a coalition government to ensure that he doesn't come to power. But nonetheless, even if he emerges as the #1 party, it still will be a very bad message for the European Union. France is now proving to be remarkably unpredictable. When we began the French presidential election campaign, Juppé was considered to be overwhelmingly the frontrunner. Juppé is nowhere on the scene. We have François Fillon, who was completely unexpected on one side, and he's actually quite extreme right. He's a pro-EU right-winger, but he's still very right-wing. Le Pen is definitely, she continues to be with roughly 1/3 of the vote. The Socialist Party is actually in danger of disintegrating and is now struggling for survival. So you may end up, ironically, with one of France's key parties falling apart, the right-wing Republican Party of France coming up with a candidate nobody had expected. So when I've asked my friends in France, they say we're no longer in a position to predict anything in our country. We have no idea what's going on, just like the Americans and the British did.
We're going to take a quick pause now and continue with this conversation in just a moment. But first, the Brexit ruling from the Supreme Court is a bit of a setback for Theresa May, as we mentioned a short while back. Now, many theories are emerging and speculations. The big question, what does this mean now for Brexit? Well, here's a look at what the next few weeks could play out.
The Supreme Court ruling is out. So where do the Brexit plans go from here on? The Theresa May government will publish an outline bill within days. The details could be announced as early as Thursday. The first vote could be held next week and passed by the House of Commons in a couple of weeks. The new bill is expected to be short, probably a one-line legislation. Both the houses will have to vote in favour of it. So how long could it take? The bill will get special priority. There are reports saying that the bill could pass through the House of Commons before the recess in the middle of February. The Lords can then consider it for it to become a law at the end of March. There are MPs who want the process to be delayed, but they're vastly outnumbered. So then the big question is, could Brexit be blocked? Theoretically, yes, but very unlikely. Why? Because Conservative MPs are unlikely to vote against Article 50. The Tories have a working majority of 15 in the Commons, which means the bill is guaranteed to pass. The Lib Dems, SNP and a few Labour MPs might vote against, but this would not be significant. Anna Verghese for WION.
All right, Swati, let me bring you back into the discussion with regards to Brexit. Let's talk about the economics in the long run. Has the economy in the country shrugged off the initial shock caused by Brexit?
I really want to sort of clarify this misconception. Most of the estimates that were out there about what the economic impact of Brexit would be were really long-term economic forecasts, which said that if the trade barriers come into play, then we would see the UK economy shrink some, because it would see reduced trade and investment with its biggest trade partner. The short-term forecasts, there were very few of them, and those that were there, we know that short-term forecasts tend to have a lot of uncertainty attached to them. So even though the economy seems to be doing well right now, or at least not sort of getting into any kind of big negative shock, I think we shouldn't sort of take solace from there and say that going forward, this is going to have no implications for the economy. I think there are going to be longer term implications, mainly because tariff barriers and non-tariff barriers with our biggest trading partners are going to become much higher.
Paul, let me get you back in the conversation. For people, understanding, for them, how does it impact the short term and the long term? I'll sort of throw this out to you. What are your thoughts on, assuming all of this goes smooth sailing, it all gets passed, short-term impacts and long-term when it comes to Brexit leaving the EU? Well,
the short-term, ultimately depends, as has been mentioned, on the nature of the trade barriers that are negotiated or not negotiated. For example, I was talking to a Tata executive. So he said, okay, Tata is the biggest industrial employer in England, and they have a huge number of different types of factories. But he said, we have to know what the tariff, if there will be a tariff on a car leaving England and being exported to the continent. So Jaguar Land Rover, we build the Jaguar cars in Britain. Now, if, for example, with the hard Brexit announcement by Theresa May, Britain essentially faces the same tariff right now, or under that agreement, that India faces when they export a car to, which is about 10%. Now, if it's a 10% tariff for Jaguar, then the next factory they build will be in Europe. They won't build it in Britain because it's just not worth it at that point. But on the other hand, if she negotiates a deal and brings down the tariff to, let's say, 2 or 3%, then Jaguar may say, okay, it's worth it to stay, expand our factories in England and employ English people. So how they negotiate that barrier, and obviously if I'm European and I'm a continental European, I'm thinking, well, I could get that Jaguar company factory in France if I negotiate really tough and say 15%, what the hell, let's make it tough for you. So you have how they negotiate will determine to a large extent, and then the other issue has been mentioned of the question of the financial companies. A lot of them are already antsy because the right for them to move, the right to them to work and move without any worry about passports or visas into England seems to be likely to fall apart.
So even those living there, the people who are in,
so in that case, so if you're going to have to get a visa every time you cross into France, for business, then you might as well just move and if 60% of your business is in continental Europe, you'll move your headquarters there. Lloyd's of London has now begun to say that, which is an amazing institution, it's a very British institution, is saying that they may have to move at least their headquarters to somewhere in continental Europe because they just can't function in a situation. Just the uncertainty factor makes it really difficult for financial companies. They can't wait 10 years to know whether or not they can function in Europe or not.
Let me ask the same question to Rachit in terms of some of the people who live there right now, immediate terms and in the next few years, as if all of this goes according to plan. Some of the people who live in the UK, how they will be impacted by Brexit, the day-to-day, short-term and long-term implications of a Brexit move.
So as Pramit mentioned, the only visible effect right now is that of uncertainty. It is very, very hard to predict how it's going to impact the economy, either in the short run or in the long run. There will be a lot of challenges. I can speak from a trade perspective that now that UK is going to be out of the EU, it will have to renegotiate its terms at the WTO. But that would still make it subject to the regulatory constraints of EU, which it used as a peg to move out of the EU. So there's a considerable challenge in accessing markets. Second, a glorious opportunity has been lost over here, where UK could be a very, very strong member in negotiating the transatlantic trade and investment partnership, which is expected to set a lot of standards when it comes to dispute settlement, when it comes to IP standards. Now, if the UK is going to be out of this, a lot of companies based out of the UK are going to be impacted by this, because access to market both in Europe and in North America is going to be severely restricted. So for the UK to move forward, what I would suggest is, at least with the friendly countries, they start negotiating the bilateral arrangements as soon as possible and try to keep the tricky parts out of these free trade agreements, which are covered substantially under WTO or investor-state dispute settlement conventions.
And Pramitpal, let me ask you about the situation of South Asians there, some of the Indians, with regards to some of the people's, deportation, the issue with visas, and how they're going to be troubled by Brexit if we have a sense of what that may be like in the coming years.
Well, for Indian citizens who live in India, it hasn't made that much difference, because we always used to have to get a separate visa for Britain anyway.
The ones who live there.
But the ones who live there will depend on the question of, again, how much they decide to do on the residency agreements. Those who are already British citizens obviously are not going to be affected. There will be residents. The question of residency is going to be an issue, because it'll be very deeply intertwined with what the British define as residency requirements for the European Union. So if they say that, there have been already cases in the British press of, a Polish woman who's lived in England for 24 years suddenly being said, okay, now you have to leave.
Right.
So if they decide to go for that level of stringency with a poll, then obviously that same level of stringency would apply for somebody from the Commonwealth.
All right, thank you so much for all of your time. Rachit Ranjan, Pramitpal Chaudhary, and Swati joining us from London. We appreciate that. We're now going to take a quick short break and continue the conversation on the other side, talking about Trump and the wall with Mexico. Stay with us here on Gravitas.